Hey, here's a controversial subject. Is radical Islam radical, or is it just normal Islam? Find out today with our guest Al Fadi on today's Redeeming Truth. World events have pushed Islam back onto the scene, and it is important for us to understand what in the world is going on, particularly in Israel these days. And for that, we brought our friend Al Fadi to come talk to us about Islam. Now, Al Fadi is somebody who knows Islam incredibly well because he was a Muslim for many years of his life. And so Al Fadi, I'm interested to understand, what is it when you were a Muslim and you heard the subject of radical Islam being talked about, would you have been a radical Muslim?
I mean, interestingly, by the way, the topic of Islam and radical Islam and terrorism wasn't as popular in my days. In fact, the Saudi government and many other Arab governments and also the CIA supported Osama bin Laden back in the 80s in his fight against the Soviets in Afghanistan. So it was kind of like an acceptable thing to do until it evolves and emerged into something totally different, morphed, I should say, into something totally different. That's in the 90s as Al-Qaeda. That's when you begin to hear about radical branch of Islam. Now, radical, if I were to use it just in a generic term, it doesn't really have a negative connotation. It means you're fundamentalist, you're a follower of Islam, its foundations, that you are by the book kind of a person. You know, so Muslims back home in Saudi who are like this, like me, or even in Syria or Egypt or Jordan, they don't view themselves in a negative fashion. They actually view themselves to be more superior than the other Muslims who are wishy-washy Muslims, technically speaking. So I would have enjoyed, obviously, the title if it was even used back then.
Really? Because you're just taking Islam seriously. That's all it would have been.
That is true.
So for you, back in the day, being a Muslim, being a radical Muslim, there was no difference between those things. You're being a faithful Muslim.
That is correct. I mean, you would say, okay, that's great. This is a badge of honor that you mean that I am a true follower then of Islam. That's why you're calling me this way.
Right. And so what are ideas that people would see as this is radical?
Yeah, so if you're in the Muslim world, you can judge people that become radical or fundamentalist by the way they dress. The beard, sometimes the shorter tope, the dress, you see it like pulled up a little bit. Sometimes you will see like a mark right here indicating that we pray a lot and we pray on the dirt and we pray on rocks and things like that. The language that you begin to use, you begin to speak in classical Arabic most of the time, and you quote hadith a lot. You bring up the Prophet and the Quran a lot, and you start like you're talking like a religious in every way. And when I start to read about the Pharisees, I'm like, oh, I know, I was like this. I know people like that. So it's more of Pharisaic, technically speaking, behavior. Sometimes people, like your family, might get annoyed by it, actually, because you become critical of everything they do. I used to be critical of some of the things my own friends and family would do that in my view, wasn't really purely Islamic.
Like what, for instance? I
mean, not praying on time, for instance, or not dressed up appropriately, or not keeping certain teachings and certain rituals. And I remember my father one time was really upset with me. He's like, I rule the house, you don't.
Right.
But and I wasn't even, I said to myself, I don't care. I'm trying to be a good Muslim, and I want to help them earn good deeds by doing the things that I'm telling them about. Yeah.
So in the West, though, radical Muslim equals terrorist. So the West wants to separate Muslims from radical Muslims. So in the West, so what you're saying is that distinction does exist in the Muslim world as well. But the issue is not Muslim versus radical Muslim. It's compromised Muslim to faithful Muslim.
That is correct. That is absolutely correct. Faithful Muslim are what we call radicals and fundamentalists. Compromise, or at least Muslims who are not knowledgeable, let's call, I don't want to use the word ignorant, but they just don't know a whole lot about their teaching, are the ones that are either, we call them, sometimes cultural Muslims, benign Muslims, nominal Muslims. The radicals will say compromise Muslims who are selling their soul basically to the world and to the West and everything else.
So when it comes to a Muslim, a radical Muslim, that the West would call radical, what are some ideas that they believe that the Westerner would hear that and go, that's radical?
Well, I mean, of course, the radical Muslim or fundamental Muslim focuses a lot on Islamic rituals in public, Sharia implementations, having things, even when they're living in the West, they want to dress up like the Muslim dress, the woman with hijab, and having a mosque, praying out in public, prayer calling in public, and at the same time, really separating yourself as a community from the rest, and even defending actions that are done, what we call terrorist actions, celebrating those things, acting like it is the way it should be, that all Muslims in the world should be backing, those kind of actions rather than condemning them. So languages like this in the West, of course, are viewed as a language of radical Islam, terrorism, and so on and so forth.
But what you're saying is that is seen within the Islamic world as that's faithful Islam.
Yes, and the proof is this. How many times you've heard publicly Muslims coming out on YouTube or Facebook or TV condemning basically the faithful Muslims. If they do, they will use the terms that the West is using, terrorism, but oftentimes they have a caveat attached to it. They don't represent Islam.
Right.
That's what they would say, and that's what the media would tell you. Oh, they don't represent the view of Islam. They're lone wolf, and whatever the case. Sadly, that's not the case. They are pure followers of Islam who are fundamentalist in their views and who are faithful, in my humble view, to the teaching of Islam. I'm thankful majority of Muslims don't adhere to that, but that doesn't negate the teaching itself.
Yeah, and so you would say the majority of Muslims out there in the world are part of the nominal group of Muslims.
Correct. And when you are talking about the Muslims in the Middle East, they don't dare to say anything negative against these terrorists because they're afraid that they would be also bullied by them or even somehow being persecuted by them. Like in Syria, I ask people, most of the 4.5 million Syrians that were displaced by ISIS, how many of them are Christians? And people think like, half of them, no. Maybe 2% of them.
Right.
The rest were Muslims because ISIS didn't consider them to be true followers of Islam.
And so you've got radical Muslims who you would say are faithful Muslims.
Yes.
And they're the ones who are doing the terrorism out there. You've got nominal Muslims who are afraid to say anything about them because those people could attack them, bully them, or even worse. And so I guess the question is then, when it comes to their view of what Islam is going to do in the world, part of that is what radicalizes them too, in the sense that they have a particular view of end times, they have a particular view of what Islam is going to do in the world, and that they see themselves as a part of that, correct?
That is correct. And they see themselves even part of bringing it to fulfillment. I mean, which is extremely dangerous once you begin to think that the end is dependent on you. And that's true of Islam, by the way. The God of Islam, if you truly study his character, he's always dependent on his creation. Yes. And the mankind to fulfill his purposes to the point that you feel like he cannot do anything on his own. I mean, case in point, he himself did not appear to Muhammad, never appeared to him, never talked to him directly, but somehow the claim is that an angel was taking his messages and talking to Muhammad. Yet when you go to the Old Testament, God himself appeared. He appeared as a person even before the New Testament, before the incarnation of Christ. Right. We have many evidence of that as the angel of the Lord, as the person who appeared to Abraham, and the list can go on and on and on.
Exactly. And so in their view of Islam as a political system, their goal is to take over the world.
That is absolutely correct. And with all due respect to my Muslim friends who will be watching this and they may be up in arms, that is exactly the teaching of the Quran. The Quran teaches you that you ought to fight until Allah's name is declared universally.
Which CIRA is that? Which chapter is that?
I cannot recall at the moment, but it's in the Quran basically that you have to fight them until the name of Allah basically is universal. That you have to cast terror in the heart of the unbelievers, and there are a number of passages that talk about that. And, Islam is the only acceptable religion by God. That's in chapter 3 of the Quran, for instance, verse 81 all the way to 85 talks about things like this. All of these references and the fact that the Muslims are the best creatures that are made for mankind. In other words, the rest of the creatures who are not Muslims are second class. I mean, right there, you begin to see the distinction that is being made. But when you study, Islam and its commands to spread itself, the use of violence and the use of terror is always associated with that.
So it's not spreading the teachings of Islam through influence, through preaching and things of that nature, like Christianity.
That's what the interpreters, that's what the clerics will tell you, that's what the Islamic scholars will say, that's what the modern Muslims will try to tell you, simply because they feel embarrassed by something like that. And even if you find some verses, for instance, there is a verse in the Quran that talks about the fact that you have your religion and the Muslims have theirs. It's been canceled. It's been abrogated, you know? Mm-hmm. So the fact that it's there doesn't mean that it's, applicable anymore.
Yeah, the parts of the Quran that those verses are in supersede the parts of the Quran that are full of tolerance and peace and things of that nature.
That's true.
And so Islamist eschatology, Islamic politics is take over the world. Where do the Jewish people fit into that?
Now, it's interesting. Christians, for instance, there is some lovely passages about them. When it comes to the Jews, it tends to be more on the negative. For instance, they're accused of corrupting the word of God. They are accused of basically turning their back on God and turning their back also on Muhammad himself. And as such, they were called names, like they were called apes, for instance, in there. I mean, my goodness. I mean, we're talking about human beings, but yet God, who in the Quran claimed that they are the children of Israel, that they are the one that were delivered by Moses, that he blessed them, even gave them a land. That's what the Quran talks about.
Yeah.
You find this, for instance, in the Quran chapter 5, verses 20-21, talks about the land as part of the blessings that they had. Yeah. Yet at the same time, you begin to see negative connotations against them. The fact that they have did not honor their commitment to Muhammad, the fact that they gave Moses a hard time, and so on and so forth. So there is a lot of the way of negativity against the Jews compared to the Christians is much higher.
So how does the end of the world within Islam relate to Judaism? Because there are passages that talk about the rocks and trees screaming to the Muslims, there's a Jew behind me, but all of that is tied to the end of to the end.
Yes, and those passages are actually found in the Hadith, the sayings of Muhammad, and the fact that the end will not come unless the Muslims will fight the Muslims will find the Jews, and even if the Jews will hide behind a rock or a tree, that those elements, those matters will begin to speak to the Muslims, telling them there is a Jew behind me. In other words, it's you can reach the conclusion real quickly. It's a genocidal war, because why would you keep killing them? And even the rocks will tell you they're behind me, unless you are going to eliminate them completely. And that's pretty much what Muhammad taught. And it's a hadith, an authentic hadith that was mentioned in a number of references, not just one time only.
Okay. So all of that is important background to understand what is happening in Israel and Gaza right now.
Absolutely.
And so as you began to see the reports of news coming out of Israel on October 7th, how were you, as a former Muslim, what people would term a radical Muslim, how did you interpret what is happening, and how should we understand what's happening, knowing what you just told us?
Yeah, I mean, the topic of Israel and Palestine in general is a very complicated one, Pastor Jon. Very complicated. Now, people tend to think it's the 1947 or it's the 1912, the Balfour Promise, or the 1948, the establishment, the official establishment of the State of Israel by the UN, or the land, that was taken. Sadly, I would admit to say that I was a Jew hater before I accepted Christ. And it wasn't until I began to read the Old Testament and understand the history of the Jews, at least in general, that I began to appreciate that history and why I am fortunate today to be saved through those promises that were made in that historical context. Yeah. But all that to say is that we need to, and I'm speaking to the believers, we need to really be careful. Just like I warned, I think, in one of the episodes about witnessing to Muslim not to bring Muhammad in a negative way, I would say don't bring Israel in a conversation unless a Muslim brings them up. You need to meet them at their level. You need to appreciate their thinking, why they believe what they believe about the Jews. And we don't want to go also completely, with the Jews or completely against the Jews. We're going to have to use a balanced approach. We need to meet the Muslims where they are, especially understand the pain that they feel because they truly believe that the Jews took their land and the Palestinians have suffered. And at the same time, we need to be careful to distinguish between the biblical Jews and the political state of Israel, because the political state also of Israel is not perfect. And many Jews today in Israel are not saved. So we have to also keep that in mind. So we cannot just take one side over the other. We need to really meet them at their level, listen to them, share the truth from the scripture about where we stand with the Jews from a scriptural standpoint, that they themselves need salvation, that Christ is coming at some point. And I think in doing so, the Muslim will begin to realize what's going on. There is a distinction between the two. This is why you as a Christian, at least when you speaking about the Jews, maybe you mean something different than what the Muslim is thinking. But we need also to be sympathetic to the fact that innocent people are dying. When this October 7th happened, that's what I was thinking about immediately. Innocent Jews have died. Pretty soon, innocent Palestinians going to die. Because I knew the Jewish, the Israeli government is not going to really sit back and do nothing. In fact, they had a chance to get rid of Hamas earlier, and they did not do it. And now it's unfortunate that they had to do it now at the expense of many innocent lives. But if you ask me, I am in support of eliminating Hamas simply because they're nothing but a thorn in the side of even Palestinian people.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So what do Christians need to know about Hamas?
Well, Hamas actually, it was founded in 1987 by a clerk, Sheikh Yassin, and this clerk was actually paralyzed. And it's an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. So the Muslim Brotherhood is the mothership where Hamas emerged from. The Muslim Brotherhood is also the mothership where Al-Qaeda emerged from. And the Muslim Brotherhood themselves were fascinated by the Wahhabi movement. So you can see the ties between all of these. ISIS also adopted the same thing. Muslim Brotherhood mentality is very clear. You have to establish the caliphate, which means you have to fight even Islamic nations, because in the Muslim Brotherhood's mind, Islamic nations that exist today are led by corrupt politicians. And therefore, you have to unite the territories of Islam under the banner of one Islamic state. So Hamas shares the same view. That's why they talk about between the river and the sea, from the river to the sea, meaning one Islamic area, eliminate the Jews completely. And in their charters, which are public, by the way, you can Google the charter of Hamas. One of those charters is very clear that elimination of the Jews or the Jewish state is part of what they believe in. In their own doctrines, they would say that their target is Allah and that the Quran is their constitution, which means if the Quran teaches about jihad, they have to comply with that, and that their ultimate goal and hope in life and the loftiest thing they want to follow is death as a martyr. Pastor Jon, if you're fighting people who want to die, how can you win that battle?
Yeah, the only way to win that battle is to kill them, is to send them to their martyrhood.
Yeah, and I watch, by the way, sometimes Jewish Netflix series. One of it is called Fawda, meaning like chaos. And in one of the episodes, the IDF person was telling the Hamas guy, "You want to be a martyr? I'm going to send you there."
Right.
That's pretty much what is happening.
Right. And so in the midst of Gaza, we're hearing about Hamas putting ammunition under schools, in schools, under hospitals, in hospitals, mosques, even that underneath them and inside of them, that they're not allowing the civilians to move south, that they're keeping them in the northern part of Gaza in order to have them there to be killed, in order for public opinion to be swayed in their way. And so everybody knows that's going on. The question then becomes, should that matter? Should it not matter? I mean, it's been an interesting thing to watch what's going on across our world, knowing that those things happen all the time, but it doesn't seem to matter.
Yeah, it doesn't matter because the claim is that this is a Israeli propaganda, that Israel somehow doctrines these stories, that they are faking it, that they're showing you images that are not true, because Hamas have already capitalized on their propaganda campaign in social media. And look, they're gaining a lot of the young minds who are truly buying into the fact that Hamas is the victim, right, and Israel is the aggressor. Now, I would say Hamas is not really that ignorant. When they launch the attack, they factor all of that in. Mm-hmm. They are already planning and preparing their campaigns to show the world this is what Israel is doing. This is what they've been doing since 1948. Yeah. And people are buying it, sadly, because you have larger group of people that are dying now versus the 1,400 Israelis. And it's all about numbers. Sadly, Hamas does what it does because when you become a radical Muslim, true follower of Islam, the value of human life doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
There is only a distinction between two. You die as a faithful Muslim, or that other Muslim is just a hypocrite Muslim, right, that I don't care if they die or not. Why would you work under hospitals? Why would you work in kindergarten and schools and other places like this, unless if you intentionally wanted these places to get damaged for the propaganda that you're trying to publish, basically?
That's helpful because at the end of the day, there's only them, the faithful Muslim, or there's the compromised Muslim. And so if compromised Muslims are killed, we will just use that propaganda to point out to the world, to further our cause, which is from the river to the sea, there are no more Jews here.
Absolutely. And sadly, you look at the Hamas fighters, who are also, in my view, are suffering right now, the consequence of what they have done. But where are the leaders? They're in Qatar.
That's right.
They're billionaires, living life.
They're in Qatar. Yeah. They're in their thousands of dollar suits, living in their $1 million mansions.
Right.
Yeah, totally. And spewing out propaganda from Qatar, completely protected. And the people there, they don't even know that that's happening, right? Or are they, how do they live in that? I mean, Gaza is one of the most horrible places to live on the planet. And yet their leaders live in absolute luxury. They
truly believe that all of these are lies and that their leaders are suffering on their behalf. At least Yasser Arafat lived there. And Yasser Arafat, in my view, was in the ground, hands-on guy, doing things. These leaders are just unbelievable. The lifestyle that they're living, it's like, who would find it to be acceptable to be leading a group yet from afar, and you're living life and they're suffering?
And so anything else that it would be important for Christians to know as they look out at the events going on right now in and around Israel?
Well, the biggest thing is to pray. I mean, because I have to say that prayer is needed. Number two, don't let any discussions in media or politicians trying to make it sound like there is always a political solution, the two-state solution, or the Abraham Accord, or whatever. Only Christ can bring peace. Only Christ can bring peace. So we need to really work to support those who are laboring in there. I know a lot of missionaries and mission agencies that are in Gaza, outside of Gaza, witnessing to both Jews and Muslims to bring to share Christ with them. So these should be our two top priorities. And then, of course, yes, we need to elect politicians that will work towards finding a peace solution. We need to find a common ground with our Muslim friends when it comes to the topic of Israel. So somehow we have to look like we are not biased towards one group over the other.
And there are Arab Christians, there are Palestinian Christians.
It's true.
And Hamas hates them too.
They hate them too, but the Arab Christians will tell you that they're also hurt by Israel and what Israel has done for their ancestors, their grandparents, when they took the land, took their home. So you need to also appreciate where they're coming from. That doesn't mean we have to always hate this group over the other.
Correct.
We need to, as Christians, we're even asked to love or commanded to love even our enemies, if that's our attitude towards Israel or towards the other.
Right. That it is critical that we know the truth. And there is a lot of propaganda out there.
Exactly.
The idea is we need to know the truth. And that's why I wanted you on this show to help us think through these things in a way that is true. That is, and so I appreciate it. Is there a sense that from what you're seeing that the Lord is at work in the midst of all of this horrific stuff that's going on? But in the ministry that you're doing, the contacts, the people that you know, is there a way that you're saying, yeah, this is a way that God is working in the midst of all of this?
Indeed. And usually when people are distressed, they're going through difficult times like this, they're more open to the gospel, open to the message of hope, message of peace. So we're getting a lot of reports from people that I am familiar with who are really praising God for the open doors now, for how this situation is creating more opportunities for the gospel, that people are starting to at least realize. I mean, not all Palestinians are oblivious. They know what's going on. They know that Hamas cost them a lot of discomfort now and displacement and even death, sadly. So people beginning to realize that there is another side to the story, and hopefully that will emanate to other parts of the world, and some who were mistaken about their stance will begin to take corrective measures.
Final question. If people want to know more about your ministry, how would they find you?
They can, of course, go to my YouTube channel. And that's, CIRA International, C as in Charlie, CIRA International. I have a website also called CIRAinternational.com. They can contact me there. We have also the Al Fadi Academy, alfadiacademy.com, where people can also reach out to me through the academy, where we're starting to populate it with lectures and things like that. I'm planning on doing something related to this matter, and hopefully we will publish it soon. But these are the ways that they can track along with me. I'm on Twitter, believe it or not. I started to use it recently at Al _Al Fadi, at Al _Al Fadi. But there I tend to be more political than just the other side of me. So
gotcha. Well, thank you for your time.
You're welcome.
Very much. And I hope that was helpful. I hope it was challenging. I hope it was informative, that we need to be people of truth. And so thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time for Redeeming Truth. Hey, don't leave yet. If you're part of the 75% of people that watch our content but haven't subscribed, this is your time. Go down and find that little subscribe button and click it. That way you will know every time we come out with more content here from Redeemer Bible Church. Also, if you would like to give to this ministry, this is the only way that this ministry can happen. Make sure to click the link down below to the give button, and you can give to the ministry here at Redeemer. And then finally, if you want to know more about what's going on, check out this podcast right here.